The summer of 1984 was hot in more ways than one for 26-year-old Helen Viola. Not only were temperatures soaring in her hometown of Perth, Australia, but she had just met the love of her life, Peter Falconio. The two bonded over their shared love of horses and riding. But when they weren't busy gallivanting around the countryside, Helen would gush to her friends about how much she adored Peter. He was everything she'd ever wanted in a man, kind, funny, and good-looking. The two were so in love that within just 6 months Peter proposed. Helen said yes without hesitation. And soon after, the couple started planning their future together, including buying a house and starting a family. But sadly, their fairy tale romance was about to take a horrifying twist. On February 1985, the newlyweds decided to go on a weekend getaway with some friends, camping out at the remote Una Road near the little town of Barrow Creek. As it turned out, this trip would end up being the last thing Helen ever did. On the morning of February, Helen woke up early and went outside to use the toilet. Just before sunrise, the sky was still dark, and the campsite was shrouded in an eerie mist. It was then that Helen noticed something strange, a blue Holden Commodore sedan parked close by, which hadn't been there the evening before. She told her husband Peter, who went over to investigate. Helen waited anxiously as he walked over to the car and started knocking on the window. But when the car started up and sped off, both Peter and Helen were stunned. Who was driving it? Was it a friend playing a prank, or was it someone else? With no way to know for sure, the couple shrugged and got on with their day. As the hours passed, Helen and Peter grew increasingly bored, so they decided to take a walk down the dusty road and see what they could find. Perhaps they hoped to discover the person who had been in the strange car. But whatever they were expecting, it certainly wasn't this. When they reached a bend in the road, they saw another car parked nearby, but it was the same blue Holden Commodore from earlier. What was it doing here? They couldn't have been more shocked if they'd seen a ghost. Helen and Peter didn't stick around to find out. Instead, they turned back and hurried to their campsite. Once there, they quickly finished packing up and headed down the road as fast as they could. They were almost at the point of Barrow Creek when they heard a loud horn honking behind them. Peter looked back and his blood ran cold. It was the blue Holden Commodore again, and it was gaining on them fast. Peter immediately floored it and turned the wheel sharply, trying to get away from the other car. But the driver was skilled and soon pulled alongside them. A man leaned out of the window and yelled something at them, though they couldn't hear what it was. Then he slowed down and let them pass. However, neither Helen nor Peter dared slow down themselves. They drove straight to the Barrow Creek Hotel and burst through the doors, shaken but unharmed. Sitting down at a table, trying to catch their breath, they described what had happened to the bartender, a tall, thin man named John Button. He listened intently, then told them not to worry. It was probably just some drunks messing around, but Helen and Peter insisted that something wasn't right. One look at their terrified faces was enough to convince John. He told them that he knew a place where they could hide out until the coast was clear. This was John's private residence, and it was far away from prying eyes. While Helen and Peter were safe there, John called the police and explained the situation. He also checked on a friend of his who lived close by and told him to keep an eye out. Then he returned to the hotel room where he'd taken Helen and Peter. For a while, everything seemed fine. Helen and Peter relaxed slightly, grateful to have found such a helpful man. But they wouldn't be relieved for long. Around 7:30 p.m., John came into the room and told them it was time to leave. The coast was clear. He drove them back to their campsite, but there was nothing left there except tire tracks. Their tent had vanished. Someone had stolen it along with all of their food and supplies. Peter was furious and demanded that John drive them to the nearest gas station so they could call the police. But when they arrived, the line to use the phone was long, and by the time Helen and Peter got their chance, the operator said that the police were too busy to come out. There had been a serious car accident in town, and they were needed elsewhere. The couple was stunned. They now felt completely alone. Then, as if by magic, John appeared beside them once more. He offered to drive them back home, and they gratefully accepted. But on the way, his car broke down, no problem. John had planned for this and told them he'd left a spare car in a safe location. After a few minutes, they were back on the road, heading towards safety. But as they drove, Helen and Peter noticed that the sky was getting darker. The clouds rolled in, and soon the car was enveloped in darkness. They had no headlights. Just when they thought it couldn't get any worse, they heard a loud bang, and the car swerved off the road. They were stranded in the middle of nowhere with no phone signal and a rapidly dwindling amount of gas. Suddenly, John slammed on the brakes and stepped out of the car. Helen and Peter could see that there was a house in the distance. Maybe they could borrow enough gas to get to the next town. But when John returned, his face was grim. The house was deserted. With no other options, the three of them sat in silence as they waited for the inevitable. In the darkness, John pulled out a knife and motioned for Helen and Peter to do the same. Then he told them to close their eyes while he counted to 100. Whoever was doing this planned to rob them, but he or she had made a terrible mistake. Helen and Peter might have been young, but they were quick thinkers. They pretended to follow John's instructions, but in reality, Helen had slipped out of her seatbelt and was stabbing John viciously. She stabbed him at least 10 times. When he slumped over in his seat, she turned to Peter and told him to get out the knife. He did so, and plunged the blade into John's chest. Once John was dead, Helen and Peter tied him to the car with an extension cord and hid his knife under the floor mat. Then they got in the car and drove away as fast as they could. By now they realized that whoever had attacked them must have been following them for days. It was a miracle they hadn't noticed it. The only thing that made sense was to drive away from the area as fast as possible. At around 4 a.m. they finally reached a petrol station and were able to flag down a passing motorist who helped them call the police. Soon they were sitting in an interview room explaining what had happened. Meanwhile, forensic experts descended on John's car. Because of the brutal nature of the attack, police believed they were dealing with a madman. The killer had shown up at the hospital a few hours later, claiming to have been mugged. His injuries were consistent with his story, but he had Helen and Peter's blood on his clothes. The case against him was strong and he was arrested. As it turned out, he'd kidnapped many other couples, but always let them go after a short time. Why he'd killed Helen and Peter, however, remained a mystery. At first their families were furious, demanding the death penalty for the killer. But as time went on, they started to notice something odd. The police seemed to be focusing on the wrong man. Witnesses had described their attacker as a skinny man with shoulder-length hair, but this man was bald and stocky. Additionally, DNA testing later proved that he hadn't even been in the car when John had died. Meanwhile, Helen and Peter were having problems of their own. While the public praised them as heroes, they felt anything but. Traumatized by what they'd experienced, the couple eventually split up. Peter moved away and changed his name. He tried to put the horrific ordeal behind him and start a new life, but he struggled with panic attacks and nightmares for years. He eventually married and had children, but he kept his past a secret from his new family. Helen, meanwhile, threw herself into her work as a nurse. Unfortunately, she was fired after just 3 weeks when she had a complete mental breakdown. In the years that followed, she would occasionally hear from Peter, but the two never got together again. Helen did eventually marry, but she was never able to fully escape the horrors of that fateful camping trip. She suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and agoraphobia, meaning that she was too afraid to leave her house. Eventually, Helen took her own life. She left behind a note that read, "I can't live like this anymore," a tragic end to a young woman whose whole life was ahead of her. To this day, the case remains unsolved. Who had attacked Helen and Peter, and why had they been chosen? Sadly, we may never know the truth. For more crazy crimes, stay tuned.